Right. So, hello everyone. I am Tathagata, as you know, and today I'm privileged to have Adrija with us. Adrija has written this beautiful book called Delhi in Thy Name. So, she will be talking about naming conventions, street names in Delhi, and their history a little bit, and then I will be talking about some street names in Calcutta, and we'll talk about why street names are important, why and how streets gets named, and how what the politics is about it, and how street names gets changed as well. So we'll just wait for a few more minutes, like 1 minute, for people to join in, and then we will be starting with the conversation. But if you are joining in right now, then um, please have a look on Amazon of Adrija's book, and you can purchase them directly. Adrija, would you like to add something to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you first of all, thank you, Tathagata, for inviting me. It's really a privilege to be on your platform. We know that the Immersive Trails does some fantastic work with regard to documenting heritage of Bengal, and I've been following you guys for a while. I'm so happy to be able to speak about my book on your platform today. So thanks a lot for that. I would like to show my book a little, to the audience over here. It's called Delhi in Thy Name, published by Rupa Publications. It is it's a historical and journalistic way of looking at street names. Since I'm a journalist, and I look at history through a journalistic angle, in the sense that not just I look at history from a lived experience perspective. So that is what I have tried to do in this book, is to not just look at street names, but also to look at how the history of street names is understood by people living in these places at present. So that's what my book is about. And I've as we speak more about it, I'll get into little bit more nuances about why street names are important, and what can street names tell us about the history of a city. That's what we are going to discuss today, about what it tells us about Delhi and Calcutta.
That's great. So I'll just start off with one question. How long have you been living in Delhi, and how and why is Delhi so special to you?
Well, so I have been in Delhi since my time in college, which was in 2009 when I joined college in Delhi University. And so it's been more than ten years that I've been in Delhi. And so if, like, Delhi is very special from a personal perspective, of course, because I did my college there. I spent my very crucial years of my life there, and I interacted with the city as a young migrant, as somebody who's curious to know about the capital of the country. But also as a student of history, Delhi is like a exciting Disneyland for history students, given the how rich in historical narratives the city is. But when while if I have to say about why I would choose Delhi as, if I have to write about street names, when I had to write about street names, Delhi is, being the capital, a lot of what is happening in India is also represented in Delhi, and in the streets of Delhi a lot more closely, perhaps. I'm not to say that it's not happening elsewhere. I mean, Calcutta also, or any other big city or smaller city, has its does say much about the history of India. But being the capital, there is a special place that street names in this in Delhi plays in, saying something about the politics of both colonial and post-colonial India.
Why do you think street names are important, though? Like how does studying or looking at the history of street names make us more familiar with the history of a region, of a place, or a city?
So, when Rupa and I conceived of this idea, the whole point was that our government was making a lot of name changes. So, if you ask me why, are street names important, then one of the key things that I would say is that because it's important to the government of a country, so we should know why. What is it that it makes the government so curious and so energized about changing names? And every time names are changed, there is so much of debate around this. So then, that's how we approached this topic, to look at why names are being changed, what is it about the name. And the more I got involved in the project, I realized that it's not just about the name of the street, it's also about a repository. It's like a repository of information that street names are have. And if we look at the map of any city from a bird's eye view, and we look at the multiple names over there, it will tell us something about the many layers of history that are going, or that are perhaps overlapping in that in the city. And I'm pretty sure that it's true for Calcutta and for Delhi, because it's when a name is being given to a street, it is one, it is telling us something about the power of the individual, or the people in power, or people in positions of power, why their ideological leanings when they name something. When a name is erased, what is it that those in power want to erase? Right? When, or and it's not just about those in power, then it's also that we know of instances when people also want to remove a name. So why, that tells us something about the moment in time when a name is given to a particular street or erased from a particular street. A very good example that I keep giving people, and I've written about a little bit in my book as well, is there is a village in Uttar Pradesh named Karuna. And till now there was no problem with that village. But for the last 2 years, the residents of the village have been wanting to change the name. Why? Because of, well, about of the times we live in, and corona and corona sounds somewhat similar, so they want the name of their village changed. So like, it does say something about the times that we are living in. And if we go to document the names of streets across the country, it would tell us about very minute nuanced ways of political changes, social changes that are happening in the country, and happening at a given time, and that which gets reflected in toponyms, in names of streets and places and institutions for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, in Kolkata as well, there has been, as we have seen, there has been several contentions about name change of certain streets, naming of metro stations, which is like
Yes.
a big project that was taken by the current government. And then there has been a
Yeah.
lot of contention about how naming metro stations on like stalwarts of a culture does not necessarily associate them associated them as them and people with that certain neighborhood where the metro station goes to, and all of that.
Hmm.
So it's like this, I think. Apart from the layers of the people in power, it also is probably, it also shows how people of a certain neighborhood want to identify themselves as well. Because if you look at like Kolkata, there are several neighborhoods which are associated with not just people but also different communities, and there are names of these communities which are associated with the, which come and
Yeah,
become associated
absolutely.
with the street names and neighborhoods. um, and also the convention of naming streets like in a commemorative way, I think is it is more of I would say a colonial influence, because I don't think we named streets that way before. Uh, but I mean, you would, Delhi is a much older city than Kolkata is, so you would probably have more insight about how streets got named before the colonial period, or around the time that Delhi was still sort of uh, sort of a backyard uh, part of the British colonial existence. How did the streets get named, and did and does any of those names survive even up to today?
I'm quite interested in doing this comparison between Delhi and Calcutta. I must say that because of course, because also Calcutta is where I'm born, and this is again a city very special to me. And if I had to look at pre-colonial Delhi and Calcutta. You would be able to tell me a lot more about what happens before colonial Calcutta. We look at Calcutta only through the colonial lens, for that matter. In Delhi, in fact, see, large parts of Delhi gets built after the British build New Delhi in 1911, and it's almost a political project. So there is a wonderful article by Narayani Gupta where she says that we can clearly distinguish between what is a place name and what is a street name. And place name is something that is more organic, which is something that people give out of affection for somebody or something, and street names being more of a political project. And it is this political project that we see once the British come to power, when their commemorations are done for a very specific political purpose. But before that, uh, it's interesting how the remnants of Sultanate Delhi, of Mughal Delhi, is seen in the street names in very it's not always visible, or on your face, but you can make out that these are names which have survived from the past. Especially when we consider that a lot of natural landscape, for instance, had to be broken down to be able to make Delhi, in both in the colonial period and thereafter. So for instance, there were these hill ranges, a lot of pahad, where Paharganj exists, for instance, or where Vasant Vihar exists. Paharganj, especially, it is taken from the hill ranges that were there. And if you think about it, these are names that were came across because you see a geographical kind, remnant in a certain place. Okay, there is a pahar here, so you call it Paharganj, or for instance, you have a lot of these hunting lodges that the Tughlaqs had built, which were called Kushaks. So you have a Kushak road in central Delhi, for that matter, for instance, or these tanks that the Sultanate rulers had built, like Hauze Shamsi and Haus Khas, which is very very popular in Delhi today as a joint for cafes and things like that. And Haus Khas was built by Alauddin Khilji to because of the problem of water scarcity, which was a very big problem in Delhi at that time. And he had built this tank, and the name of the place has survived. And even though yes, we know the Hoskas village and the remnants of the Tughlaq monuments are there, we often forget that these are names that were given, that came about much before. How, like horse and specifically, literally, it means a tank, and it was given by the sultanates. But when I had to do my research, where I started off was with Mughal Delhi. And it's very interesting the way Shahjahanabad's, the names of the places in Shahjahanabad have been given and continues to survive as well. So a lot of these names were basically, they were named after people who lived in these colonies, or maybe somebody's house, maybe, or a particular community, or a particular set of a professional group that lived here. For instance, you have this lane called Suiwala in Shahjahanabad, which is named after those who were selling needles, sui. Or you have another road called Paiwala, which is named after like people who would sell foot of beds, or Churiwala, named after those who sold bangles. Then you have the concept of bazaar, which was a very important factor in among the Mughals. You have like Urdu bazaar. Basically, it is named after the language which basically came out from of a mix of Hindi and Persian that was spoken in the army. So you had an Urdu bazaar right next to the Red Fort, which has now been shifted, some closer to the Jama Masjid area, Meena Bazaar. So these are names that have stayed on. Names of people, for instance, these are not commemorative names. These are basically names of people who were living in those streets, and people perhaps just identify the street from so and so's house. For instance, you have a Kucha Hira and Kucha Hamid in Old Delhi, what was Shahjahanabad, and it is named after the architects who built the Red Fort. And again, like it's not something that was done in a political manner per se. It was essentially a way of identifying, in that street, So Hamid stays, perhaps his estate is located there. So that is how you name the street as Kucha Hamid. Now, it is also interesting that after 1850, the revolt of 1857, large parts of Shahjahanabad, the Red Fort was destroyed by the British for security reasons. And we know that a lot of name changes happened. A lot of new names were given to streets when the British built Delhi. But it's very interesting that these little streets in old Delhi, in Shahjahanabad, have continued to exist in the same name, with the same names. Why that is the case, how why they have persisted, is something that is not easy to understand, but they have existed, despite the many ways in which Delhi has expanded thereafter. I'm also curious to know from you, now, that what about pre-colonial Calcutta? Are there streets that are, remain, that carry names of pre-colonial Calcutta?
Yeah, I mean, not obviously not like Delhi, because Calcutta as a city, as a modern city that we know it today, with city limits, city limits that we associate Calcutta with, that was obviously in the pre-colonial period. There were Calcutta as a city did not exist. There were some fledgling large settlements which had markets and all of that, shopping districts, and also this massive major road that came from north and connected to the Kalighat temple in the south, the Chitpur road. So that brought pilgrims from all over Bengal to Calcutta. So that obviously existed. But in terms of the road names, I would not say that there are any older road names that probably survive. Like pre-Kolkata road names probably do not survive based on what I have seen. Uh, but the names of several neighborhoods have survived. So, for example, Ahiri Tola. Ahirs are milk, like cowherds and milkmen. So that's where settlements used to be. So that's why there is a neighborhood called Ahiri Tola. There is Potua Tola. Potuas are the Potuchitru pot makers and all of that. So that exists. Kumartuli, which is not as old as we think it is, but also as Kumors were settled there for various to serve various families, because at that time obviously there are no uh, steel or plastic uh, utensils, so you
Hmm.
use pottery, so to serve several families, and later they became idol makers. So those kind of places exist. And then we have this entire patti where there are the which is called Chana patti, which is where it's not very far away from Ahiritola, where you have the lot of these paneer makers and all of that, paneer and kheer makers, who has their settlement over there. So these kind of neighborhoods, even in southern parts of Calcutta around Kalighat temple, there are several. There is Potuatola. There are other of these crafts groups. So the settlements associated, neighborhoods associated with crafts groups, they existed. And these mohallas, as you will probably call in Delhi, these paras in Calcutta, the names of the paras are more or less intact, but in terms of the street names, I don't think there was a convention to name that in that way. So generally people would say that
Hmm.
this is the rasta that went to this certain tola or certain para and all of that. So basically it was Chitpur road was the road to Chitpur. Chitpur is a village outside Calcutta, just outside Calcutta, so surrounding the Chitteshwari temple, in near Borana, Kashipur area of today. So that was the road that went there. So that's why the British called it Chitpur Road, because people used to call it the road that went, like the rasta that went to Chitpur. So these kind of things. Other than that, I mean, I think the naming convention, naming cities based on commemorating certain person or uh, or certain events. For example, there is a street, there is a Waterloo Street and all of that in the city. So so these kind of street names are mostly colonial enterprise, and it showed that it was a way of showing control over the city, their capital, and it was also a way of trying to recreate home in a faraway
Hmm.
sort of land. So more familiarize themselves more with uh, being familiar with what they are used to at home. So I think that process is a very colonial exercise.
I'm also curious to understand another thing is that we know that much before the British came, Calcutta as a city is was a major trading port as well, and you had before the British you had a lot of other Europeans also coming in. So do these commemorative naming, they don't happen when the other Europeans also come in? Is it just a British thing? Because in Delhi, of course, it would be a British thing because the capital shifted when the British moved there, and it wasn't exactly a city where a lot of other European powers came before the British moved. But I'm curious, was it only the British? What about the Portuguese and the Dutch who were also in Bengal? Was commemorative naming not a part of what they were doing?
So the Portuguese were doing that in their settlement in Bandel. The Dutch were doing that in Chinsura. French were doing that in Chandanagar. But Kolkata, even though there were a lot of the other communities there already present, the Armenians, the Parsis, the Dutch, the not the Portuguese, and the French, none of them actually saw it as their settlement. It was the small settlements that was on this side of the river was not theirs per se. Like it was not that they had the right to rule or administer there or collect taxes there. The British are the first ones to do that, and they had to then, in order to reclaim the space, I think they it was required that they think about laying out the city at the best they could, even though most of the city grew organically. Think about laying the city out the best they could by using naming conventions they were used to at home.
Hmm.
And that was also another way of showing power. As
Hmm.
you said, that street naming is a way to show who is in charge, and also after whose name you name the streets also shows who were prominent people in the eyes of the people in power.
Hmm.
So so that's something that happens only with the arrival of the British and
Of the
colonialism
British. Hmm.
coming in front.
Yeah.
So that we have a question from Bishwajyoti Banerjee, and which I think will help us to segue into our next few topics. So the question is this: do you think we need to rename streets and chalks in order to decolonize our urban systems?
Um, it's a difficult question to answer. Mm, I don't know if there is a need per se, but yes, definitely, it completely depends on how people look at the names of the street as well. And so however much the authorities in power might want to erase the name, if people want to hold on to it, they will hold on to it regardless of what a name is in official registers. A case in point is the name of Connaught Place in Delhi, or what is very popularly called City in Delhi, which was there was a very strong attempt to change it and rename it after Mr. Rajiv Gandhi when after he passed away. But people wanted to hold on to the name of the Duke of Connaught, even though they had no idea who the Duke of Connaught was. But it gave them a certain level of prestige, and it gave their it's a place full of shops and eateries, and it gave them a way to look, a sort of legacy to look back on, and colonial legitimacy to their name. So I think it depends on what people also want to remember. But I don't believe that like renaming is the only way to decolonize. There are a lot of things that we are holding on to, and we cannot really erase our history in any way, like that cannot happen. If the fact that India is a post-colonial state will be true even if you do not rename streets. So I don't believe that we need to rename streets to be able to decolonize, and that cannot happen. I don't think so.
Also, do you think that by like in some ways we, as we go ahead and we are familiar with certain colonial names of certain streets, somehow they become more identifiable to us. Like, we identify ourselves more with the older street names, even in the case that the street names are renewed, because we do not generally see them as something colonial. We have just grown up with that street names. For example, many people of my father's generation still call College Street MG Road, Haddison Road. So things like that. We still call Park Street Park Street, not
Yeah,
Mother
of course.
Teresa Shoruni
Yeah.
and all of that. So do you see that happening in Delhi as well? With
Yeah, of course, with a lot of names, in fact, that, but not with all names. There are other names also. For instance, the Curzon Road that has been renamed as Kasturba Gandhi Marg. um, People identify it as Kasturba Gandhi Marg. Now, it also depends on what name catch on. What people considered important, or as a very important figure. Maybe like the Duke of Connaught may not be so important at all. So that is why it doesn't really matter. So they have held on to the name. But in case of Curzon Street, perhaps, because also we Curzon being an important colonial figure, it perhaps affected people's sentiments more, and would people would want to get rid of his name and identify the street more as Kasturba Gandhi Marg. So it is it is also the way in which people interact with history and what they want to identify as part of their history. And what you're saying is true. And another case is, of course, the name of Calcutta in itself. Like even today we call it Calcutta. However much the government has renamed it as Kolkata, maybe because we have grown up it identifying ourselves as people from Calcutta, we prefer the name over Kolkata. And it's something that is more. It has to do with how we organically look at the name of a city or place, or a street, and that um, it's subconscious sometimes. Sometimes it's conscious effort, but more often than not, it is a subconscious way of what we associate with our past more.
Yeah, I think okay, so we can move on to the next talking point, which is about different communities. So we started with talking about mohallas and all of that, based on certain communities, but um, there is also an impression, like, huge influence of migrants in these cities. In
Hmm.
Delhi, of course, in the like, for a long time. In Calcutta, there has been, when it was the one of the second cities of the empire, and I say one of the, because Calcutta was not the only second city of the empire. There were cities like Glasgow and other cities elsewhere with the British Empire, which were considered second cities as well. Um, just to clarify that point. So there, because of it being the second city of the empire, the prominent city of South Asia, there has been a lot of migrants in the city, and we have street names or neighborhoods which are associated with these migrants and their histories, their, like, specific community specific histories. So what are some of the prominent stories of, like, street names or neighborhoods that you see in Delhi, and are they still, if even though maybe some communities have left, are they still in, like, do they still evoke some sort of memory of the time among the local community, or is it the memory is completely forgotten?
So, one very important point to remember over here is that street names can also tell us about the patterns of migration in any city. And if I had to compare, the pattern of migration in Calcutta is very different from that in Delhi, because like I mentioned before, that, Calcutta was a major trading port much before the British came in. So you have a lot of communities coming to Calcutta from the Chinese, the Armenians, the Scots. A lot of things are happening in Delhi. In my understanding, large part of the migration happens in the post-independence era, when you have a lot of partition migrants also moving in. You have people moving in from large, different parts of the city for better opportunities, job opportunities as students, or as government servants. There are as aspirants who want to crack the government service exams. So that kind of migration happens essentially in the post independence era. Although there I have, like, for instance, there is a very rich history of Bengalis in Delhi. And an interesting nugget of information here would be the road that is named after Dr. H.C. Sen, in which is near Chandni Chowk. And he was a famous doctor who lived in Old Delhi, and in fact, Old Delhi, this entire area around Chandni Chowk, it had a very large and vibrant Bengali population, people who moved there as entrepreneurs, as doctors, and things like that. And
What
of course,
entrepreneurs? Bengali
yeah,
entrepreneurs?
yes,
That
yes,
that
yes. There's
that is going to shock some people.
no, there is a very it's very interesting, the kind of Bengali entrepreneurs there. There's a mills there is a paper mills company that was also started by another gentleman. I forget the name. I have written about this rich history of Bengalis in Delhi, which is quite exciting, and I found it quite exciting, and even though today we perhaps identify Bengalis in Delhi with the popular CR Park, which is a much later creation. In fact, uh, most Bengalis in fact lived near Daryaganj, Chandni Chowk, and Karol Bagh, for that matter. And as of now, the only street name that I could come across of this legacy is Dr. H.C. Sen Marg, which is near Chandni Chowk. Now, with the other communities, a large number of partition migrants, and it's very interesting. One is that if you think about it, perhaps a lot of these communities would have wanted to name the places in which they are living after the cities or little villages that they had left behind. A case in point here is this place called Gujranwala in North Delhi, which is named after a place which is now in Pakistan, and you name wherever you move to after this place. And a lot of people who migrated to the villages in of Delhi as well, they carried names of the villages there with them. But in post independence Delhi, you also it post independence Delhi is also a political project of the government of India. And so even though you have a little bit, a few of these remnants of places that people left behind, or another place, a very interesting case of how migrants have brought whatever memories of the lives they left behind, is Pamposh Enclave, which is named by the Kashmiri Pandit community, which had been migrating from right after 47 onwards, and they built a new colony in Delhi and named it as Pamposh, which means lotus in Kashmiri. But most of the other neighborhoods that have that in which partition migrants reside, have been named after nationalist leaders. It is a political project how the government goes about naming these places. In my chapter on CR Park, I have gone into a lot of details about how this process happened in case of CR Park. In fact, for that matter, CR Das was not the first name that the residents of CR Park wanted. There were a lot of other options, including Tagore and Subhash Bose, and like there a very a popular one was Purvanchal, which Purbachal, which was how the people of CR Park wanted to identify themselves. And CR Park is also sandwiched between Kalkaji and GK2 on both sides, both of which are fairly vibrant West Punjab migrant residents. And I remember speaking to a gentleman who had told me that we wanted to assert ourselves, that we come from the east, from the Purbo থেকে আসি আমরা. So we wanted to assert ourselves, and that is why we wanted to the name as Purbachal. But again, there was a lot of politics over here, how one group of people did not want Purvanchal. There is a there was a movement going on near Assam at that time, in to name a certain area after Purvanchal, and the Bengalis of CR Park did not want to get involved in it. And so somebody reached out to a politician in the government, and how they intervened, and finally CR Das's name was proposed. Of course, the CR Das, being a prominent figure in the Congress party and the Congress government in power, wanted his name to be commemorated. And of course, now if you speak to residents of CR Park, they will say that that they will have many great things to say about CR Das, when he was a very prominent freedom fighter, and has a very important role in the nationalist history of India. But the very fact that it wasn't exactly the first choice, it was something that was imposed on the neighborhood from the political power, is an interesting way to look at even the way patterns of migration and how residential neighborhoods came to be named by the government rather than by the people. That did not happen in the case of Pamposh and Clay. People, they did keep alive whatever they wanted from Kashmir. But in case of Bengal, this was the case. It's another thing that Mr. Siardas also was from Bengal, so I guess that was a way of also ensuring that Bengalis were happy to keep their leaders in names intact. So this is that's how I feel that the naming of neighborhoods and it can reveal a lot about the migratory patterns. And so because in case of Calcutta, the fact that you have roads that are named after prominent Jewish tradesmen and or Armenian tradesmen, it also goes to show the sort of power that these people had been able to establish in the city in the course of their stay in the in Calcutta, or the influence they had in a city like Calcutta. A lot of this is also commemorative because perhaps they gave a lot of grants, a lot of you know social work, etc., was done by them, and it was a way of paying respect. But that is not how migration or communities coming into Delhi, they interact with the city, because most of it happens in a post independence period where Delhi is more of a project of the government to show something to India, to showcase something to the world. And that's somewhere I feel that it's very different. So what do you
Yes,
say about
yes.
Calcutta's
Yeah, yeah.
way of
Siarda seems to be the contentious character in Calcutta as well in terms of street names, because when the Central Avenue was getting built in the 1920s,
Hmm.
the British obviously wanted to name it Central Avenue because it was built by Calcutta Improvement Trust. So there was a tussle between the Calcutta Improvement Trust, which was run by the British, and the Calcutta municipality, which was run by which was over supervised by, like, the mayor was Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose at that time. So
Hmm.
there was this tussle about whether to name it Central Avenue or Chittaranjan
Hmm.
uh, Chittaranjan Avenue. So ultimately, obviously, Chittaranjan Avenue won after a lot of these. I have, like, looked at newspapers where there have been very regular editorials written by opposing sides about why it should be named Central Avenue, why it should be named Chittaranjan Avenue, and all of that. So ultimately, again,
Hmm.
in this case, C.R. Das's name prevailed,
Okay.
and it became Chittaranjan Avenue, which is what it is still known today. A section of Central Avenue is still known as
Hmm.
today. But once again, most people are just refer to it as Central Avenue rather than Chittaranjan
Hmm.
Avenue.
Hmm. Hmm.
But that's the history in terms of migrants in the city. Obviously, we have names, like street names. We have Ezra Street, which is at the heart of the
Hmm.
Jewish area in Calcutta, which was named after Ezra, who was one of the prominent early settlers, Jewish settlers in here. We have Armenian Street, which basically is the road, that very narrow road that originally ran to the Armenian church, and the Armenian settlement was around that. We have Portuguese Church Street, which is the main Catholic cathedral of the city. And there were settlements of the Portuguese, and the Portuguese cemetery used to be there. So these kind of street names are still in use in the city without us realizing why they're in use often. Like, there are tons of offices on all of these streets, and people go there every day. But there's like, obviously, there's no blue plaques or anything to basically mention, to inform people about why these street names sound non-local.
Hmm.
Also, in terms of in Chinatown, there is this very interesting street called Sanyat Sen Sarani, Sanyat Sen Street. Now, Sanyat Sen Street, this was a commemoration that was done right after the Chinese Revolution of 1912. Like, it was done right after the revolution was successful. Um, and Sanyat Sen actually played a huge role um, in like Calcutta played a huge role in actually supplying and supporting Sun Yat-sen with money and with men being sent from Calcutta to fight as volunteers in his war against the like in his civil war, in his revolutionary war. So because of such an influence on and constant contact between Calcutta and Sun Yat-sen's Nationalist Party, that the road name was overwhelmingly after Chinese deputations to the British government. They agreed that they will rename to the old street. I'm forgetting the old name of that, but they will rename that into Sun Yat-sen Street right after Chinese revolution was successful, and that was also done in the with the aim that that might appease the Chinese community enough so that the British can finally have an ally in China rather than a hostile power, which is again very true for like in today's world as well. In different parts of the world, in order to appease some ally, you commemorate something of that ally in your country. So yeah, that's and then what happened was it actually backfired because Sun Yat-sen started sending arms and money to the Indian freedom fighters to fight against the British. So that really did not work
Yeah.
out. Yeah, so there are names like naming that has been done for various reasons, which are named which the street by which the streets have been given non-local names, both because of the presence of the communities, but also as a commemorative way to appease the community or
Hmm.
appease some big person in the community and stuff. Um, yeah.
What about the Marwadis? I know, like they have been a most influential community in Calcutta, and there must be streets named after the Marwadi communities.
Yeah, there is a lot in Bada Bazar area, but I would not consider Marwaris as an immigrant to the city
Hmm.
per se, because Calcutta was never a Bengali city. It was
Hmm.
a very cosmopolitan from the very beginning. So,
Hmm.
for example, when Job Charnock was coming to settle there, one of his primary contacts in the city used to be a Jat merchant. So there was already a significant number of Jats, Marwaris, Armenians even in that sense, Armenians present in the city even before the British arrived. And it was not like Madras or Bombay where the British settlement actually kicked off the migrations into the city. There were a lot of group like these communities, and it was basically a tapestry of various communities settling there together and working together, having businesses and all of that. So it was always a cosmopolitan place rather than
Hmm.
being
Okay.
something which is Bengali only, and then suddenly it
Hmm.
blows up and opens up to the world.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I think we are coming to the end. We can probably end by talking about the politics of changing names, especially
Yeah.
in Delhi, because we very frequently see in newspapers about certain Mughal names of street names or Muslim street names are being removed
Yeah.
and uh, replaced with more acceptable sort of in a within quotes names. So what is going on in that aspect, and how are the
It's
local
very
communities
interesting.
perceiving it?
It's very interesting, like when you said that, acceptable Muslim, names. A very good example would be the how Dalhousie Road has been renamed as Dara Shikoh Road, because this is the good Muslim, you know so
Because he
there is a
read.
distinction. Yes, because there is a distinction between who's a good Muslim and who's a bad Muslim, and which which has been quite, adapted by the popular masses to look at, okay, Aurangzeb is the bad Muslim, Akbar is the good Muslim, so we will not touch Akbar Road. We will, but Aurangzeb Road was, it became a hugely contentious issue when Aurangzeb Road was renamed as after Dr. Abdul Kalam, the president of India, and that time it was a fairly contentious issue. Even though nobody had a problem with, somebody like Dr. Abdul Kalam, why would anyone have an issue with his name being on any street? But the issue was with erasing the name of Aurangzeb Road, even though, a lesser known fact is that it is not the Mughals who named Aurangzeb Road, it is the British who had named Aurangzeb Road. And while you're wiping off the name of Aurangzeb Road, you're also wiping out a very, important source of history of the way the British had built Delhi, why these roads were named after Aurangzeb, Prithviraj Chauhan, Akbar Road, Shah Jahan Road. These were very conscious political attempts at building New Delhi after 1911, when the British wanted to say that, look, these are the roads named after all the greatest Indian monarchs, and we stand right beside them. We are part of this huge legacy of the capital of Delhi, which has been the capital of India for a very long time. So this was something that the British had done, but of course, modern day politics does not look at the nuances of these ways in which street names have come about. And when Aurangzeb Road was removed, it is today Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam Road. But it's another very interesting thing to remember over here is that every time a debate like this comes up, I think the government today is making these names even more popular than what they are. I'm pretty sure a lot of people in Delhi did not even know that Aurangzeb Road existed. A little street that existed, but the paper started flashing about what Aurangzeb Road is being renamed, and so you also, by renaming, you also made the road more popular. And I remember reading this very interesting article by Mr. Ravish Kumar, in which he said that now henceforth we will not be able to think of Dr. Abdul Kalam Azad without thinking about Aurangzeb, which is a very very true fact. And of course, other than that, a more recent attempt at name change was when the Bhumi Pujan of the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya happened, and Babar Road then was very symbolically, it was it was thought to we should rename it as 5th August mark, 5th August being the day on which the Bhumi Pujan had happened. So so there is such a very conscious way in which the current government is wanting to assert its own political ideology and its own way of reading history on the people through erasure of these names. And I think Delhi being the capital, of course, a lot of these names are also again being experimented on a lot more extensively. I would say there is a lot of debate around these name changes that happens more on in newspapers among academics rather than among the popular masses. That is, I guess, it's more of an intellectual debate that happens in the newspapers, etc., when any of these name changes happen. But it's also interesting that the current Delhi government has not attempted any of this. The Aam Aadmi Party hasn't, in my knowledge, made any of these name changes. I'm also curious as to whether in Calcutta, be it the central government or the TMC in current power, has attempted to rename any streets.
So earlier in the TMC's period, I was not in Kolkata. So earlier during 2011 onwards, so I don't really know what happened then. But a lot of road name changes happened right after the independence in the city, especially from the 1958-59 onwards. There was this push
Hmm.
towards decolonizing the road names. That also basically went on towards taking down statues as well, different statues of different European Western figures from different places, and replacing them with statues of local like Indian freedom fighters and poets and politicians and others. So that went hand in hand in the 1960s, and in 70s and 80s during the left front period there were plethora of name changes. So for example, the government place section of government place east was renamed Marx Engels PT. Then the road in front of it's called, I think it was Russell Street, which went in front of the US and the British embassies, the Vietnam the consulates. The Vietnam War was going on, so they renamed that into Mark Sun sorry Ho Chi Minh Shorani, so that they have to write Ho Chi Minh Shorani on their addresses of these two consulates. So there are several things like that happen, and Kolkata's roads anyway have various different names. Different roads have single road may have two or three different names. So for example, the road that passes just in front of my house over here, it's Lake Road, and also it's Lake Avenue, as well as Sharat Chandra Chatterjee Street. uh, and then in front of my mother's house, the road that runs, that's Maniktala Main Road, which was an old name, and
Hmm.
the current name is Satin Sen Sarani, although no one knows where Satin Sen Sarani actually is. Um, Even the banks don't know, and that's why we had problems, like a lot of problems in documentation, because we have to write the official name, but no one actually knows what that is.
Hmm.
So these kind of things, but this is a more long term legacy in Calcutta, I think, from right after independence, at least since the 1950s onwards, rather than something that is happening with TMC. I
Hmm.
don't really, except for Shidu Kanu Dahor, which is the road, which is the name of a section of, I think, Indira Gandhi Charani right in front of the Eden Gardens. Apart from that, I think there hasn't been many changes. But then, as I said, in the early days of Trinamool Congress, I was abroad, so I was not aware
Hmm.
of anything that was going on here at that time.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
Okay.
So there is a comment by Bishwa Jyoti. I think it's a response to what we said. It says it's queer how we accept one colonial name for the other. Case in point, Theatre Road to Shakespeare Sarani, but not so when the name is more desi, a politically correct one. I think we bongs have this penchant for all things English. I don't know what being politically correct is in this sense. I mean, Theatre Road was called Theatre Road because there was a theater there, and I think that is why, or without realizing that there was, like it was renamed into Shakespeare Shoroni. I don't know if the people who renamed it realized that it was called Theatre Road because it literally went to a theater, uh, rather than just something that's commemorating a theater. Uh, so, I mean, I don't know what. Being politically correct is in this sense, like
I,
in terms of
I,
road names.
I think what he means is that had it not been Shakespeare and had it been a more desi political figure, maybe Bengalis might not have or the people of Calcutta may not have accepted the name change so easily as with Shakespeare Shorody. uh, you know but I don't think that's the case with a lot of other Indian names. People have accepted them. We know of like especially in the post independence period, a lot of colonial names were renamed after freedom fighters in from India. The Dalhousie Road, for the Dalhousie Circle, for instance, it is named
Yes,
after
Bibi
the.
Divag, yeah.
Yeah, and people have accepted that, even though in colloquial terms, we call it Dalhousie even today, and people use Dalhousie Circle and the BBD mark interchangeably, perhaps.
But
But
they will understand if you use it interchangeably, so
yeah, yeah.
that's unlike any other, like unlike uh, Mother Teresa Shoroni and Park Street,
Hmm.
which is no one will understand
Yeah.
what Mother Teresa
For that
Shoroni
matter, I
is.
did not know before you told me this morning that Park Street is called Mother Teresa Sharodi. But again, like for instance, if you tell somebody in Delhi where is Haley Road, where a lot of people may not know, but Kasturba Gandhi Marg, a lot of people would. So it completely depends. A lot of nationalist figures have also been very wholeheartedly accepted by the people, and they wanted them to be changed, and there was there is no disregard for these name changes as well. You have I read somewhere recently that you have close to 450 institutions and places in India named after the Gandhi family, Nehru and Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi, and clearly people accepted them fairly happily.
Yeah. Okay, I think there are no other questions, so I think we should close the discussion gradually, and this will be up online so people can see it and share it and all of that. I would like to give a shout out to Rupa for facilitating this session today as well with Adrija, and also thank you, Adrija, for agreeing to do the session. I hope it was enjoyable for those who listened and those who will listen in the future. So thank you, Adrija, and thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Tata.